and welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2021. In this session, we're going to be focusing on the work of Kazia, an Australian oncology biotech highlighting solid tumours. With me is their CEO, James Garner. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Vivienne. It's great to be here.
Tell me a bit more about Kazia.
Well, Kazia is an oncology biotech. We focus purely on the development of new cancer therapies. But we have a slightly different business model from a lot of companies out there. We don't do our own in-house research. We're not trying to discover new drugs from first principles. What we do instead is we look for drugs that we think have huge promise, but that currently sit in other companies and which don't fit for the strategy of their existing company. And that might sound like a rather esoteric business model, but in reality, most big pharma companies produce more drugs than they have the resources to take forward. So a lot of very promising drugs that just don't fit with what the company is trying to do end up either getting left on the shelf or more commonly these days being partnered to other companies. So we've tried to build a business around this, essentially being a great partner to larger companies. Now, the first drug in our pipeline really illustrates this strategy. This was a drug that was developed by Genentech, really the most successful developer of oncology drugs in history, now, of course, a subsidiary of Roche. And Genentech developed this drug, paxalovid, up to the completion of phase 1 human trials. They decided that brain cancer just wasn't going to be a strategic focus for them. And so we were able to bring it into Kazia, and we've taken it forward since. That drug has just now entered a pivotal study. We've been thrilled with some of the data that's coming out of it. So this really shows how we've been trying to build Kazia as a business and how we see it going forward.
So essentially, you're scouring the cupboards of pharma to see exactly as you said, what they've got on their shelf. Now, this particular drug, paxalovid, is being used for glioblastoma, which is a hugely difficult brain tumor to treat.
That's right. It's really one of the most challenging cancers in modern medicine. And it's a disease where we've seen almost no improvement in the last 2 decades. Still, the prognosis for a newly diagnosed patient with glioblastoma is around 12 to 15 months survival. And the 5-year survival rate, the proportion of patients still alive 5 years after diagnosis, is around 3 to 5%. Now, by comparison, the same figure for breast cancer is closer to 90%. So it really gives a sense of just how poorly treated this disease is, and sadly how devastating a diagnosis of glioblastoma can be for a patient and their families.
It's one of these tumors that actually spreads its tentacles right throughout the brain, so it's very difficult to deal with surgically or even using radiotherapy or any of the standard approaches. How does the approach with paxalovid differ?
Well, ours is a drug treatment, of course, and the way the drug works is to target a biochemical signaling pathway called PI3K. And this is one of these not very catchy abbreviations that of course, scientists and drug developers love. But broadly speaking, the PI3K pathway controls the growth of cells and tissues. And in many forms of cancer, it gets switched on. So the cells just grow out of control. And that's pretty much the definition of cancer. What our drug does is to switch this off again. So it really takes away the growth signal that's driving the tumor. And what's great about this way of treating cancer is that we already know to some extent that this works. There are 4 FDA-approved PI3K inhibitors on the market. 3 of them treat various blood cancers. 1 of them is for treating breast cancer. So we know that switching off this control mechanism works. We're now trying to do it in the brain. And what's unique about our drug is it's the only one of these PI3K inhibitors that is able to cross the so-called blood-brain barrier. Huge problem for treating any disease in the brain. And so we think it gives paxalovid a really unique differentiation in this field of PI3K inhibition.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is how do you get it across the blood-brain barrier? So that's a tremendous advantage to start off with. So can you summarize the data that's emerged from your phase 2 study?
Yes, we have a phase 2 study ongoing right at the moment in the United States at 6 hospitals in the United States. And this is still ongoing, so all we have at the moment is interim data. The most recent data was presented in November 2020 at the Society for Neuro-Oncology annual meeting. And we've looked at two measures here. We've looked at progression-free survival, which of course is really a measure of the ability of the drug to slow recurrence and growth of the tumor. And we've seen there a figure of 8.4 months. Now, by comparison, the standard of care drug, temozolomide, is associated with a progression-free survival of about 5.3 months in these patients. So it looks as if there's a very material increase. We've also looked at overall survival, which is a measure of quite simply, does the drug extend life? And there we see an overall survival of 17.5 months. The figure for temozolomide, the comparison is 12.7 months. So on the face of it, it looks like quite a material increase over the existing standard of care. Now, to be clear, this drug is not curative, and sadly, very, very few cancer drugs are. But what we tend to find is if these results hold out in a pivotal study, we can then build on this with combination therapies, with finding different ways to give the drug, with identifying particular patient populations, that all of which gradually extend the utility of the drug to clinicians. Now, the other caveat, of course, is that we're comparing here against historical data, as is a single-arm study, and these comparisons are never perfect. But the size of the difference, the magnitude of the difference, gives us a pretty high level of confidence our drug is doing something. And on that basis, we've moved into a pivotal study.
Yes, I was going to say, tell me more about the pivotal study, and also add, if you would, what's the range of survival times? Because it's often difficult when you say just an average, what the range is, and whether there are actually some people in that who are really extending lifespan.
Yes, it's a great question, and by definition in a clinical study, it's sort of the information you get last, because obviously the longer the survival, the longer those patients take to show that in the study. We certainly do have some patients in our study who, sad to say, have been passing on within 6-8 months, and that's that's unfortunately typical for glioblastoma. We do have one patient who is still on drug, still progression free, more than 2 years after diagnosis. And so not merely is that patient alive, but there's no recurrence of their disease. And that's quite unusual in glioblastoma. That's definitely a relatively extreme result. So obviously there's a whole spectrum in between, and that's why we have to try and sort of aggregate the data. But we do see some patients who really seem to be going for quite a long time on the drugs. So that's really encouraging.
And does that suggest that there may be some some genomic variation that you might perhaps in the future use this drug with a companion diagnostic, for instance?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. What we often end up trying to do is sort of work out why some patients respond better than others, and sometimes we get great answers to that question. Sometimes not so much. We do know glioblastoma is a very heterogeneous disease. There's a wide variety of genomic alterations that lead to glioblastoma. And at the moment, in current clinical practice, most of those probably have very limited significance. But as new therapies come along, some of them become much more significant. So this is certainly something we'll be looking into. Obviously, we really need to get as much data as possible. We need to get as many patients as possible to really start picking out these signals. And that's what our pivotal study will help to do. That'll be a much larger sample of patients. And so we can hopefully start to see a little bit who's benefiting most, and that will hopefully guide how we use the drug.
And where are you undertaking your pivotal study, and do you think recruitment is going to be affected by COVID?
Yes, we've been watching really carefully. The pivotal study that we've joined is a little bit unusual. It's actually a study that's being run independently of any individual company. It's what they call a platform study. And it's called GBM Agile. It's been set up by a not-for-profit group in the United States. with the leadership of really most of the top clinicians in the glioblastoma field. And it's designed to take multiple drugs in and to run them in parallel, to compare them against a shared control group, and then to determine which ones are effective. So it doesn't, unlike some clinical studies, is not trying to just find one effective therapy. The idea is that potentially some or all of these drugs could graduate successfully from the study. And we certainly hope that will be the case with paxilosib. But this is a really efficient and, really very cutting edge way to develop a drug, and something the FDA has been pushing the industry to consider for a long time. So we're really excited to be part of it. One of the many great things that we like about GBM Agile is that it's a truly international effort. So it's already up and running in the United States, and we're recruiting patients to the paxilosib arm already in the United States. We started that several weeks. We started that several weeks ago, so just at the beginning of this year. And the study is rolling out now over the course of calendar 2021 in Europe and in China, and also in Canada, in fact. So this is going to give us a really nice geographical reach with the drug, and should give us the best possible opportunity to show its benefit. We've been watching really carefully the potential impact of COVID, and of course, particularly in the United States at the moment, it's been devastating in many places. The trial so far has not been very profoundly effective, and I think this reflects partly the fact that these are patients with advanced cancer. Their care has to continue. They can't be asked to come back in 6 months. They have to be looked after. And a lot of the resources that are used for their care in the healthcare system are not easily repurposed for COVID. So we haven't actually seen too much impact on recruitment. Certainly haven't seen any material impact in GBM Agile, and in the other studies we're running, we've generally not seen too much impact. So hopefully that may continue, and of course, as vaccines and so on roll out, that will hopefully start to take the pressure off.
Can we just talk a little about toxicity, because PI3K inhibitors are known for their toxicity levels. What about paxilosib's safety profile, and how does it compare with the other PI3K inhibitors on the market?
There's certainly a little bit of a stigma around the PI3K class, or at least there has been historically. One of the first drugs in the class to get approved was associated with some very significant GI toxicity and some liver toxicity, carries a black box warning. In fact, as the class has matured, as we've seen new drugs come along, we've seen huge differences in the toxicity between agents. So it seems like these toxicities are not class effects. They're not inherent to PI3K inhibition. They're really quite specific to the drugs themselves. And indeed, the newest drug to have been approved, we really see a fairly favorable toxicity profile for a drug in advanced cancer. When we look at paxilosib, on current evidence, we appear to have a very safe member of the class. We really just see three main toxicities. We see mouth ulcers, oral mucositis, as the clinicians refer to it. We see hyperglycemia, an increase in blood sugar, and we see rash in some patients. And these are completely typical class effects of drugs hitting the PI3K pathway. They can be unpleasant for some patients. Clearly, oral mucositis, the mouth ulcers can be quite unpleasant, but it's easily treatable. We can give patients steroid mouthwashes. We can give them oral anti-diabetic drugs. So we feel that on present evidence, we appear to have potentially a best-in-class toxicity profile emerging. And that's really important because the patients we're treating are newly diagnosed glioblastoma patients. We're trying to keep them fit and well for as long as possible. And of course, in those circumstances, patients don't want to be confronting very challenging toxicities.
You get the impression that the brain cancer field is suddenly, the therapies are suddenly starting to move in a way that we haven't seen for many years. What's the competitive landscape like for glioblastoma?
Yes, I think it's absolutely true that we're seeing a lot more focus on brain cancer. And when I started my career in industry, which wasn't so very long ago, we really tried to design drugs so that they wouldn't enter the brain. We were just worried about the toxicities they would cause in there. Brain cancer generally in all its forms was just almost considered untreatable. And I think that's still that sense still dogs the work in this space a little bit, but we have been seeing huge progress. What I think is different here is that some of the drugs we've been using in other forms of cancer probably are never going to get the same traction here. So, for example, some of the immuno-oncology drugs that we've seen such progress with in diseases like melanoma probably aren't going to be as applicable in glioblastoma, just because the immune system works so differently in the brain. It's what we call immunologically privileged, and it's a very, very cold tumor. So these kinds of drugs generally don't show as much promise here. And there have been a couple of large-scale studies, particularly with nivolumab, and they've all come up empty-handed. So I don't think this is going to be a field that's revolutionized by immuno-oncology. When we look at some of the biologic therapies that we've been using, Avastin, for example, is approved for recurrent disease, but only in the United States, not in Europe. And I think one of the challenges here is these large antibody drugs just don't cross the blood-brain barrier. There's just no easy way to get them into the brain. So their use is probably limited to very advanced disease where the blood-brain barrier is very degraded. So I think the future is going to be these sort of small molecule targeted therapies, drugs like paxalicib. And there are a few of those in development, but there's probably no more promising target than PI3K, because about 85 to 90% of these patients have some dysregulation of the PI3K pathway. So it's almost ubiquitous in this disease, and that just makes it almost the ideal target for this disease.
You mentioned Avastin there, which of course was a Genentech discovery. So you've licensed this from Genentech, and that was in 2016, I think. Can you outline the background to that transaction and its key terms?
Yes, we started out building Kazia in 2016. Kazia was actually built in the shell of a previous Australian biotech company. But we always had in mind the strategy of looking for great drugs in other companies. We became aware of paxalicib, or GDC84 as it was then known in Genentech. And we saw in this a drug that just perfectly fitted our strategy. It was a great drug that just didn't fit with what Genentech was trying to do. So we did spend, and Genentech unusually was open to licensing it. This is not a company that out-licenses a lot of drugs. But I think there were some real champions for GDC84 in Genentech that I think there was a huge reluctance to leave it on the shelf. And so the company unusually entertained the idea of partnering the asset. We spent some months trying to convince them that we were the right people to take it forward, and were ultimately successful right at the end of 2016. The commercial terms of that deal, we paid $5 million up front. And we have some very, very light touch milestones really around approval and commercialization of the drug. And then a royalty, which is undisclosed, but is very low double-digit royalty, if I can put it that way. So we feel like we got a good deal, but obviously one that certainly recognizes Genentech's very considerable investment in the drug. And I think it creates just a nice win-win situation for both companies.
So if all goes well with the pivotal study, when do you think you'll reach the market?
Well, the GBM Agile pivotal study is slightly quirky in this regard, in that it's an adaptive study. So the number of patients it recruits, and therefore the duration of the study, both get adjusted throughout the study on the basis of the emerging data. So one thing we know is that it won't recruit any more patients than it needs to get an answer. But exactly what that number of patients is not clear going in. And that's a little bit different from most pivotal studies. Now, probably the best case scenario sees something like a 2-year duration to the study, which would potentially have paxilosib on the market in 2023. Probably more of a sort of conservative base case would be a launch in 2024. So we're looking at that sort of timeline for the drug.
Anything that investors should look out for in terms of milestones over the next 6 to 12 months?
I think it's going to be a busy year for us. Obviously, there's a lot of operational work around the GBM Agile study. And as we start opening new countries and things like that, we'll be sharing that progress with investors. We will be seeing final data out of our own phase 2 study. We already have a pretty good sense which way the wind is blowing with that study, but it'll be still very encouraging when we do see the definitive data from that. And then meanwhile, we have 6 other clinical studies ongoing in other forms of brain cancer. Glioblastoma has always been our primary focus, but we've always seen a lot of potential for the drug outside that. And so we'll be starting to report some data from some of those studies throughout this year. And I think that will be really interesting because that potentially opens up a whole new field of opportunity for paxilosib.
How much cash runway do you have?
We raised $25 million in October of 2020. And that covers the bulk of the costs around GBM Agile. So we're in the comfortable position that we have money in the bank and we're in good shape. We're not living hand to mouth like so many biotech companies are obliged to do. And you know, as the study progresses, I think we fine tune our future funding requirements to the progress of the study. But for the time being, we're well funded. We're in a happy position of not having to rush out to the market anytime very soon.
And what's your longer term commercialization strategy?
Just as we've never tried to be a drug discovery company, we've never really aspired to be a drug commercialization company either. We've always thought larger pharmaceutical companies can do a better job of that than we can. So our desire is really to own the middle part, the development of the drug, and then to partner it out for commercialization. And that's work that certainly starts now. In fact, I would say it's been ongoing for a year or more now. But as we really start to see more and more data out of paxilosib, I think those conversations really take on a very different tone. So I think our assumption, our expectation, our plan is that we will partner the drug to one or more larger companies for commercialization. That said, it's a slightly different argument in every territory. So the possibility of holding on to some rights for it in some territories isn't something we've absolutely ruled out. I think our only constraint is really just to make sure we get the drug to patients and to make sure we do whatever maximizes value for shareholders.
2020 has been a really difficult year for almost everyone, you know, locally, nationally, globally. It seems like despite all of that, you've had a very good 2020. How are you looking forward to 2021?
We're super excited. I think we've been thrilled in this past year to really see positive data emerging from our drug. And one of the good things about the drug development industry is that everything boils down to data, you know, in a way that cuts through everything else, even something as world-changing as the COVID pandemic. Fundamentally positive data transcends even that. And I think that the data we've been seeing out of paxilosib in the last year has given us a great deal of confidence that we have a really promising drug candidate here. 2021 is going to be a different focus for us. I think the last couple of years have been exploratory. They've been really trying to prove the concept around the drug, if you like. The next couple of years are going to be much more focused on really the moving towards commercialization. It's going to be about operational delivery. It's going to be about putting in place the resources and the infrastructure and the mechanics to see this drug to market. So I think our focus shifts as we move into 2021. But I think the journey ahead is looking very exciting for us as a company, and you know, this should be a really interesting year for us.
James Garner of Kazia, thank you so much for talking to us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.